So this is basically about how we've tried to look at a 3-year process towards making our cities bid for the European Capital of Culture. And when you're given a chance like that, and actually given the chance of 3, even 4 years, it makes sense to look at other ways of not just writing a bid, but you might say writing the city or rewriting the city. So this was a challenge in which it was about how to create a basis for, you might say, change thinking, change management, and change environments. And of all the criticisms made about these big European capitals of culture, it was a question whether this was just another city trying to put itself at the center of Europe just for its moment of fame, and just another excuse to spend a lot of money to attract the creative class, or at least make us rich, and anyway just for a moment. Or just another project which might well be messed up by conflicting interests, which always seems to happen after the good plans, conflicting personalities and factions. Or just another branding exercise where the visionary usually is taken over by the sellable, and particularly in times of stagnant budgets where everybody will play safe and protect their own institutions or ideologies. So we were trying to sort of think about a project which was more about cultural capital than capital of culture, and that a project which is driven by open, you might say, honest processes by people with open mindsets which create open programs. So we don't believe in things like open calls where the call is open but the projects are very closed because everybody just wants to get money to do what they usually do. So this is a project which tries to understand and values resources and not just finances, which hasn't been said a lot about, but a lot of it is to talk in another terminology. And these resources, of course, are not just cultural resources, or infrastructural. And also a project which addresses like working across sectors, regional differences, and not end in compromises, as what usually happens in cultural planning or any other kind of planning when it comes to the political thing. But how do you keep visions alive? How do you actually make them translate into visionary solutions and not just, you might say, compromises? And it was also driven by the current theme, which is obviously very apt at the moment as more and more artists are engaging themselves or re-engaging themselves into the arts or into culture. It's talking about no aesthetics without ethics, and where we go from artworks to art that works. So that was also basis of the kind of philosophy. And with cities like Aarhus, which like to call themselves big cities, or as Aarhus does like to call itself, the biggest little city in the world, it's about enticing the city out of its provincial state of mind, but without either losing its head or its innocence. So that was the sort of point of departure, and so cultural capital is about change, transformation, but what kind of change, how do we generate, and how do we manage change in an increasingly hostile or even just a static environment? And actually, the static environment is more a problem than the hostile environment, because if it was hostile, you'd at least know what you're up against. Static is just, that's the way it is. Normality is the rule of the game, and that's the worst situation, actually. So with that, we tried to look at this, and I don't think I need to go into this very much. You know all about the concept and approach. So we're talking about cultural planning as to looking at the city as a cultural phenomena, and looking at this idea of fluid interactivity and constant communication. So it's the beliefs, it's the symbols, it's the stories, it's the people, and so on. You know all that, ad nausea. So we tried to put this into a framework of 3 years. I think before you start any exercise like this, you have to make sure you have a political mandate. A political mandate to give you the freedom and also the constraints. But make sure you're not just working in no man's land. Make sure you're just not working at the periphery and don't know how to get back to the center. you have to start at the centre and come back to the centre, but you particularly don't have to stay in the centre. So you have to have a strong, as visionary and as open point of departure, and that has to be also, not an open checkbook, but it allows you to do almost anything. I think that's very important that you talk of methods, you don't talk of results, and you don't detail things, but you actually need a situation of trust. Situation of trust and situation of actually expecting anything. But on the other hand, nothing being promised. So this is the situation you start, but you need that mandate. And our first step was, of course, to think of methods of cultural mapping, but as I said before, cultural mapping has to go on, and then we said from the cultural mapping, then we have to have almost, you might say, cultural visioning. So we looked at the mapping before we started the visioning, and after the visioning, we will talk about projects and programs, and then we will talk about a proposal, which will be a proposal, and with that proposal, we will go back to our political mandate and say, that's what you got. So those are the very clear steps over 3 years. So it's a long process, it's quite an involved process. That's what the process took. 3 months to do that. The mapping, of course, which takes a long time, maybe could even take longer. Vision workshops for 3 months, project workshops for 3 months, proposal for 6 months. The difficulty is it's not doing the things themselves, it's what happens in between. Because 3 years is a long time to keep the same people interested, to have the same politicians to give it focus, to have the same rhetoric, to have the same agendas in society. It's a long time. So you also have to be adaptable, but you also have to make sure that information credibility is not lost between one phase and the next. Otherwise things, fold up. And either it becomes mapping on a shelf, or visions on a website, or projects which are located in people's back pockets, or whatever. It all has to be brought together, and it all has to be, you might say, filtered in the same way, although the information is very, very different and very sporadic. And at the same time, you have to do something else. Between each of these sessions, these sets of things you have to report. Firstly, back to the people who gave you all that information and that trust, and to make sure that they understand what they can get out of it. And you also have to make sure that there is an understanding somehow in a broader, with regards to citizens as such, how is this going to help our city? And on the other hand, you have to report back to the stakeholders, the councillors, the boards, about what you're doing, how it's going, and what's happening, because they're hearing things in the city, and they're saying, well, what are you doing there? And that was a strange event there, and why didn't they come, and what was that argument about, and why is that in the local paper? All these things. So you have to actually, although that's part of the fun and part of the game, you have to bring it very solidly down to the same people to keep it on track, to make sure they don't start to say, that's too much of that, and perhaps we ought to take over, and perhaps, so on. So to keep a process like this, because you must understand in a process like this, you are in a way a person non grata. You're working in a field between the city as an authority, as a political and civil society. You're creating a bridge, a dialogue between civil society and sections in the civil society and the city. You are trying to work on that, but actually you don't belong to either, or you belong to both. So the whole rhetoric of doing this from the city's point of view, I feel, is actually quite problematic. Quite problematic, because then you're just trying to get information to use and put back into the usual systems, the usual way of thinking. So I'm very dubious about that will ever take off actually as something visionary, and not just something which is just informative and gathering data and gathering points of view and mapping who to not to tread on and who to watch out. But I really do think there is a whole case of this, which Franca was talking about this thing of empowerment. This not only implies implicitly empowering people to do their own planning, mapping, planning, future thinking, but actually that's the whole, I think, one of the main ethos of the whole exercise. And if that's not taken from this point, from the start, I think, you'll get a half-baked consultancy exercise. So that's that, right. Looking about then we're looking at now one of these things. We're looking at the cultural mapping. So if we just look at the cultural mapping, and I must say all these structures, the cultural mapping, the vision workshops and the project workshops, they all had specifically designed formats. If you did, we did 13 vision workshops with 700 people. They all had the same format. The content was very different, but the same format. And we did project workshops. We've had about 1,200 people in our project workshops. It's all done in the same format because it can be looked at across, down, and almost, you might say, longitudinally and sort of vertically. It's important you have the methodologies in place while there's total freedom as regards the content. So that was the. But they've all had a, you might say, that. So if we're looking at how we did the cultural mapping was split over a period of about 18 months. And even that cultural mapping, and that's a very simple drawing of it, was taken through in processes which was very much thought through. We started with a workshop because this whole idea of cultural mapping, if you talk to a city about cultural mapping, there are 10 people who know about it, and they were all on the same course where Franco Bianchini also spoke. But apart from those 10, nobody knows what you're talking about. So the first thing we did was invite 167 participants to a workshop, actually a 2-day workshop, on what cultural mapping is about, to make sure that they understood in their institution, their organization, their community, their local authority, when we came up with this plan, they knew what we were talking about. And we had lots of different short exercises for these people to play around with. I mean, doing sort of miniature cultural mapping exercises in groups and whatever. And I think we worked about with the 40 different models. And that came out in a little handbook, a little sort of a print easy, quick to do handbook that said, this is how you could do your mapping of your street or your sector or your things. It just gave some ideas. From that, we invited some of them back and said, okay, we want to find at least 10 major themes to work on. So we brought some of those people back, the people who responded best, and the people who were, you might say, very in control of or gatekeepers, you might say, in the city, and had 10 afternoon meetings with them and said, well, how should we go about this? How do you think the people in your sector or your area would look at this? And from that, we designed 22 themed SWOT workshops. And this was a massive exercise because these 22 themed SWOT exercises took 4 hours. And again, they had a certain format. And they were about between 40 and 60 people in each SWOT. So I did SWOTs like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday. But and it's important that you are there all the time. And it's important that your team is there all the time because it is also informing your team about how they have to think. So the SWOT, that was actually, I think, the most important, the important thing, and it worked fantastically well. We produced, and after each of these, we produce information. We produce books, we produce website stuff and whatever, and this produced 2 books of 120 pages each of the region and of themes which were used also by the region after in their local planning projects. So we made sure that we didn't just do things for ourselves, we did things which were useful for the participants. And almost a week after, the participants could use the information in their work. So that gave added legitimacy, that they were using the same set of information for their daily projects that we would use in a year and a half for the project. So that means it has a double use, but also, you might say, creates relationships and also underlines the common goals and so on. So we did those, and from those theme SWOTs, then we actually found out we would have 40 to 50 individual mapping projects to map a major series of themes. They lasted from 6 months. All different types. We'll come to that. After that, we did a presentation of the city in which we had 7,000 people who came and took part because they also had to react on this. We asked the general public to come with reactions to what we'd found out. So we had 7,000 people coming in, and telling us about, they wrote on the map, I like to play here, or I don't like that, or, they would take part in very, very easy commenting those mappings. And after all that, then we made a documentation which is about 500 pages or something, and that is the basis of our bid. So it's not just about making a bid or making a project, it's actually using the bid to do something you're not supposed to do. Tell the city probably some things it doesn't want to hear, and the politicians about some things they've forgotten, and other people's about some things they've never even thought about. So you're using the fictive, you might say, a fictive narrative of a project that might be to try to rewrite, as I said, the story of the city. And that creating a fictive, which also means fictive, which also means not serious, not playful, but it also means unreal, is a wonderful thing to do, because as soon as you put it in a city planning context, it becomes very dangerous, or an economic context, because other people get excited and think about, that's my area, that's my budgets, that's my you might say power structure, that's my committee. But if you frame it somehow in something which is unreal, you can go far further, and you also are keeping it at the level of a game. The question is then whether you can turn all the results into something which is just not a game. But what I mean is, it's very helpful to create a platform which is not a real platform if you're really going to play around with people's identities, people's priorities, and whatever. It gives them the sense of security, it gives them the sense of openness, but it also allows you to go in and, you might say, toy with that and work with it. Whereas the same questions you would not be able to do if it was called, this is a new way of doing a city plan. My theory, but I think there's a lot to be said. Now, what kind of results do you get out of it? For something like this, of course, the first thing is it gives you some information. But as I said, you get very specific information, and this specific information is not to be it has a relevance. It might be if you're doing. We had exercises on children who are doing exercises on their so-called ghetto areas. Drawings, diaries, all these kind of things, and that was important for them, and it's also important, hopefully, and I think it was, for the planners and architects working on it. But of course, it can also say a lot more than it does specifically, which means it can be cross-referential and go into your, you might say, information database. About that information, you might be able to link to something else. Similarly, involvement. It's important here that you involve the establishment and not just the marginal. Projects like this, if they're called cultural planning, tend to only involve the marginal. The young kids, or the people who don't have anything, or the people who are not normally included in other kinds of planning exercises. So you have to make sure that the head of finance sits at the same table talking about green solutions than the guy from the School of Architecture, but also from the local environmental society, and also Mrs. Whatever, who keeps writing these ridiculous stories or ridiculous letters to the newspaper. They have to sit in the same group. So you also have to structure that about the participants. It's not just the themes, it's not just how you do it, but who sits with who. It's like good dinner, it's like inviting people to dinner. You put them at the tables where it really makes a difference, and you're managing processes, you're managing communication, you're breaking down barriers, you are deconstructing the city, and you have to go through the deconstruction phase before you reconstruct it. So all the barriers have to be down, all the hearts have to be open, all the doors have to be, swing doors. You have to do that. That you do by, in that you might say, the involvement. At the same time, you build up legitimacy. The more people you involve, the more themes you work with, and the more people you build up legitimacy for your own project, but also about the process. The process itself will become the center, and should be the center, of the project. Give it a name, do something, but give it a personality. Give it something, give it somehow a body, give it a face, and don't just call it a technique or a system or whatever, but make it something which is alive. So that about legitimacy, and of course at the same time you're getting legitimacy from the communities. You are then getting political credibility. You are widening in your area to make decisions later and to make decisions which are against what perhaps the norm is. So you are you're increasing your scope as this goes on, and of course you are team building. And this is most important about mapping and about that, is that you're not just building your own teams or even teams in the city, but you're actually finding people who would translate these ideas afterwards in the community. So your team is also out there. Who are you going to work with? You're testing them. You're trying to work out who would be the good people to work with. So that's the kind of, you might say, the results. Now, it also gave us something else. It also gave us our theme, which we needed. And I think, again, you have to, at some point, through all these cultural planning things and all these processes, although, I hate very much finding themes and finding ideas. That's why this is so, unimaginative, and it's a rehash of many things. But it's very useful because it actually just puts a question. But also, perhaps in this time, in our time, it seemed to be very apt, not just locally, but in the European context and a global context, about really looking at radical changes of society. So if you have that theme, and that theme somehow becomes one with the process, and that's implicitly then bought in by the politicians, you stand in a very strong position, because that theme they have to buy into, because that has been given credibility, and the theme allows you even more to start questioning status quo, set structures, set decisions, and set on. So the theme underlies the whole thing. And of course, when you're talking about a project like this, you have to start working with not just a new theme, but you have to have themes which actually, you have to find a new language. One of the problems about, as has been mentioned several times, and Franco mentioned it, is that we haven't moved because we use the same words as everybody else has used. We use the same terms as everybody else has used. They are so, you might say, and they are so non-committal and misused, we don't have our own language. Any professional association has its own languages at some point where nobody else can understand what they're saying. Everything we say is understood by everybody because it's so banal and it's so bland and it's so ordinary. Well, what's new? What's new? So in a way, we're going to have to find our own. I'm not saying this should be it, but it's just a way of thinking about how to get a whole set of, you might say, from rethink, then we go on to what do we mean, what we're trying to do. And not every project will relate to all of them, but we're saying to every project we do, at least 3 of them, we actually have some more, have to be relevant. And we've even done a word book of, you might say, a dictionary of rethink. So we have a rethink dictionary about how we translate remix, reuse, and what it means and how you can use that. So we actually get people to start talking with the same references. They're referring to the same point of departure and to the same way of thinking as a way of communicating about each other to avoid, of course they can talk together, but forcing them within the same sort of set framework then makes them, part of each something, so it becomes a sort of conspiracy, and also allows them to explain things in a very quick, coded way. And it's amazing how much then you unite the guy from the mayor's department and the guy from the Green Institution, because then they started talking about the same things. So from that, we also look at a toolkit and said, okay, from there we develop a toolkit. And again, it's not because every project has to have all these things, but it's a toolkit in which you work with. So we give people you might say, a methodology about when we're talking about our project, what do we mean by mobile programs? And we give them a thing, mobile programs are,